Hello and welcome back to Outside Views. Today we're asking a question that many people have debated since 2016. Has Brexit actually brought any benefits? 5 years after leaving the EU, politicians are still struggling to define Brexit's success, while many Britons feel let down by the lack of tangible improvements. But is there a case to be made that Brexit has brought some advantages? Or are these so-called benefits nothing more than political spin? Let's start with regulation. One of the main arguments for Brexit was that the UK would no longer be bound by EU rules and could set its own regulatory framework. According to the government, this has allowed Britain to move faster and be more flexible in certain industries, particularly in financial services. By adapting regulations to better suit UK markets, London has remained competitive as a global financial hub, despite fears that Brexit would diminish its status. But has this truly been a game changer, especially with still transition periods running? While Brexit supporters claim regulatory freedom is a major benefit, the reality is more complex. Many UK businesses that trade with the EU still have to comply with EU standards in order to access the single market. Diverging too much from EU regulations could mean losing access to a major trading partner, limiting the advantages of so-called regulatory freedom. Another frequently cited benefit is procurement. The government argues that by leaving the EU, the UK is no longer bound by European procurement rules, meaning it can prioritize British companies when awarding contracts. This was a key promise of Brexit, that Britain would invest in itself first. In practice, however, the results have been mixed. The UK has not dramatically changed its procurement process, and in many cases, government contracts are still awarded to foreign firms. Without EU competition rules, there's more room for strategic investment, but whether this leads to real economic growth remains uncertain. And next, let's talk about trade. One of the biggest claims during the Brexit campaign was that leaving the EU would allow Britain to strike its own trade deals, free from Brussels constraints. The UK has signed agreements with Australia, New Zealand, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. However, the economic impact of these deals has been quite small. The UK's own estimates suggest that these agreements will only provide a fraction of the benefits lost by leaving the EU single market. A trade deal with the United States, once considered the crown jewel of post-Brexit trade, remains elusive. And with Donald Trump's return to power, you know what's going on with tariffs and so in the future. And meanwhile, trade with the EU has suffered. Exports are down and businesses face higher costs due to customs checks and increased bureaucracy. Despite promises of global Britain, Brexit has made trading with the UK more complicated, not easier. And then there's the immigration, one of the major topics this week. During the referendum, a major argument for Brexit was taking back control of Britain's borders. And indeed, Brexit ended freedom of movement between the UK and the EU. But did this actually reduce immigration? Ironically, net migration to the UK is now higher than before Brexit. And while fewer EU workers are coming to Britain, there has been a surge in immigration from non-EU countries, particularly for work in healthcare and education. The UK government has had to issue more work visas to fill labour shortages, meaning the actual number of new arrivals has gone up and not down. So, if controlling immigration was a Brexit benefit, it hasn't worked in the way many voters expected. Another impact of Brexit is on foreign policy. Some argue that the UK now has greater independence in global affairs, unshackled from the EU's collective decision-making. Supporters point to Britain's strong stance on Ukraine as proof that it can act decisively on the world stage. However, critics argue that leaving the EU has weakened the UK's global influence. Without a seat at the EU table, Britain has less sway over European affairs and has to negotiate new bilateral agreements that it previously handled within the EU framework. And now let's discuss the economy. The UK no longer pays into the EU budget, saving the government around £9 billion per year. But the economic damage from Brexit has far outweighed these savings. The Office for Budget Responsibility estimates that Brexit has reduced UK GDP by 4%, and that's roughly £100 billion in lost growth. Investment in Britain has declined, and many companies have relocated at least parts of their operations to the EU. And what about cost of living? One of the most direct effects of Brexit has been rising prices. Food costs have increased due to new trade barriers, and the UK faces shortages in some goods due to supply chain disruptions. Instead of the promised economic boom, most Britons are now paying more for everyday essentials. So where does this leave us? It is true that Brexit has provided some areas of flexibility, such as regulatory independence, procurement opportunities, and foreign policy autonomy. But so far, these benefits have not translated into the economic or social improvements that were promised. Trade has suffered, immigration has not decreased, and the cost of living has risen. Even Brexit's biggest supporters admit that the UK has not yet fully realized its potential outside the EU. But the question is, will it ever? Or will Britain continue paying the price for a decision that promised much but has delivered little? Thanks for watching Outside Views, and if you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time, and the next video is already right here in the end screen.